Port Melbourne is today a somewhat wayside suburb out of the path of most travellers, but 180 years ago this couldn't have been further from the truth. Port Melbourne served as the main port for not only the mail and goods being delivered to the colony, but also most of the immigration moving into the city. This importance was not lost on its early settlers, and the idea for a railway to the port is one of the oldest concepts within the entire city. Today I will explore the early history of this line, as well as the company that would capitalise on it, the Melbourne and Hobson's Bay Railway Company. The area of Port Melbourne was well known to early settlers of Melbourne, and it was only a matter of time before it was settled. The first reported European settlement at Port Melbourne was surveyor William Wedge Darke, along with his family, in early 1839. At the time, the area was characterised by its defined, pristine beach, followed slightly inland by a steep, sandy ridge. It is from this that Darke gave the area its first name, Sandridge. You mightn't have heard of Darke before, I certainly hadn't before researching this, but you may have heard of his boss, a man named Robert Hoddle. Hoddle was the first senior surveyor of the Port Phillip colony, and he designed the road layout for most of Melbourne's inner suburbs, including the city itself. In March 1839, he decided, on account of Darke, that Sandridge was the ideal location for the city's port, and drew out a rough road layout. Following Darke, a man with the glorious name of Captain Willebram Friedrich Evelyn Liardet would settle at Sandridge. By the time Liardet arrived, Darke had already departed, and the only settlement was a small fisherman's hut. Liardet and his family quickly established a hotel, and by 1840 it had grown with several piers and even a mail service. The following decade saw the town expand, roughly following Hoddle's 1839 layout. By 1850 it had grown to be one of Melbourne's largest suburbs. But there remained a problem. Any goods unloaded at Port Melbourne needed to be carried by cart up City Road over Princes Bridge and into the city. Whilst this wasn't a long journey, the lack of capacity on horse-drawn wagons just wouldn't do it for the growing city. The first solution to this was drawn up by Hoddle in 1839, before Port Melbourne had even really been settled. When planning out the road layout for the town, he included provision for a railway from what would become Town Pier, down Bay Street and into the southwestern corner of the CBD. This railway would not be built, obviously, but the idea still remained. The first serious proposal for a railway was presented in a speech at the Melbourne Mechanics Institute on September 7, 1851. The proposal was rather vague, but it did stipulate a line from Sandridge to the city at a distance of 1 mile and 63 chains. For rolling stock, the promoters specified 2 locally constructed 16 horsepower engines that were to be acquired, alongside 12 wagons and 3 carriages. Local opposition at the time caused the project, which was estimated to cost around £60,000, to fail. The next proposal would be the one to stick. On August 18, 1852, a crowd gathered within the Chamber of Commerce in Melbourne. Here, James Blackburn, the city's lead surveyor, took to the stand. He spoke of a railway from the corner of Swanston and Flinders Street running over the Yarra and to a terminus just north of the town of Sandridge. This alignment was altered from earlier proposals, which had used Bay Street to run directly into the town. Instead, Blackburn stipulated a new, much larger pier that would be built exclusively for the railway. He stipulated an initial cost of £72,000, however this would soon be raised to £100,000 once more reliable costing had been done. Soon, the actual company began to form. A Mr. J.B. Watson was appointed as secretary, and a Mr. W.S. Chauncey became the lead engineer. Several other key decisions were made, such as the selection of a 5'3" gauge and the refinement of the alignment. Soon after, a bill began to be drafted for presentation to the Victorian Parliament that would legitimise the company and cement government support. This received royal assent on January 20th, 1853, and the company was legitimised. The company was initially valued at £100,000 divided into 2,000 shares, with each share going for £70. The Act stipulated several more details regarding the railway. The company was to be directed by a 6-man board of directors. Each of these directors must have at least 10 shares in the company and are elected by a vote from every shareholder, based on the amount of shares that they owned. At least 3 of the men had to be present for any business regarding the company to take place. Furthermore, one of the 6 men was appointed president, and this president was able to appoint a chairman to take his place if he was unable to attend. In terms of infrastructure, the Act authorised the construction of the line along the stipulated alignment, as well as granting 50 yards of land on either side of the line for the company, free of charge. The pier at Sandridge was authorised to be built out to any length up to 1,000 yards, from which an extension would require an alteration to the Act. Any road crossings deemed unsafe by the Crown would be brought over the line by a bridge. This stipulation was not relevant to the line yet, however would soon prove detrimental. The Act also stipulated maximum fares on the line, with the company restricted to charging just 1 shilling for a second-class passenger and 1.5 shillings for a first class. In modern Australian currency, that translates to $7 and $11 respectively. Not bad, but per trip that is still more than modern PTV fares. The rest of the Act goes on to detail the finances of the company and also stipulates the safekeeping and management of the company. It also outlines some rather excessive punishments for the grand offence of throwing gravel, rubbish or stones. In all, the bill stipulates that the line must be completed within 2 years of its passing and that the first meeting must occur within 1 month. Now with funding, a route and a deadline, the Melbourne and Hobson's Bay Railway Company was truly born. Work commenced almost immediately. James Hentley, an English immigrant, was labelled as the company president, with Chauncey remaining as the company engineer. Soon, contracts were being released for the construction of the line. In end, tenders were granted to Mr. Daniel Pritchard for earthworks, Martin Smith and Company for the Yarra River Bridge, Willoughby and Mason for Sandridge Pier. Lots of what was needed could not be contracted locally, however. Because of this, all rolling stock, machinery and rails for the railway were to be imported from England. Most of these were to come from Robert Stephenson's and Company in Newcastle upon Tyne, England. Work began in earnest on the line at the end of September, as Pritchard began the earthworks. Under direction from Chauncey, the earth used for these works was produced from beside the alignment itself. Whilst this may have sped up construction and lowered cost, the sandy soil was far from the best quality available, and its use would have consequences in the near future. Regardless, by early 1854, earthworks were complete and track laying could begin. By the first company report in June, a single line had been laid from Sandridge to just short of the Yarra River. The bridge over the Yarra was progressing well and would be completed by July. The Melbourne and Sandridge termini were completed quickly, and the engine sheds/sidings at Sandridge were done by June. Among all of these successes, however, there remained one glaring issue: the pier at Sandridge. Work began on the pier in roughly January 1854. Whilst at the start it was going well, it was soon realised that the ground below the bay was much softer than expected, and rather than expend the extra costs to fix the issue, it was chosen to just shorten the pier length, down from 500 feet to roughly 200 feet. This was a massive issue, as the depth of the water below the end of the pier was now only 12 feet, much too shallow for some of the larger ships in the bay. This blunder was not unnoticed by some of the company's directors, and Chauncey would soon resign. He was replaced as head engineer by James Moore, a local Irish immigrant. One of Moore's first acts with the company was to survey a branch from the Sandridge line to St Kilda and Brighton. Moore's original St Kilda alignment went south of the town of Emerald Hill, through St Kilda and on to Brighton. Whilst the idea was nice, the company still hadn't finished the Sandridge line and it would have to wait for another line. The closer the line got to completion, the greater the pressure from shareholders and the public to open it grew. But there remained one key hurdle: locomotive power. Whilst the carriages and wagons had arrived from England in July, by August it was still unclear where the locomotives were. The last news the company had received was from March, and it stated that the locomotives should be ready to ship by early April. In reality, they wouldn't leave for Melbourne for several more months and wouldn't arrive until December. In the meanwhile, it became clear that the company would need an engine to assist with the completion of the line and to run the first services. The first engine was constructed by Martin Smith and Company, the same company that built the Yarra River Bridge, to haul wagons for the ballasting of the line. It was constructed from one of the spare wagons imported earlier in the year and a steam pile driver, likely from the construction of the pier. The single piston was connected directly to the axle, and whilst the engine wasn't very pretty or very easy to use, it did its job. It first ran on June 2nd, 1854, before track laying was even complete, and became the first steam locomotive to run in Australia. It reached a top speed of 30 km an hour, hauling several wagons containing company directors as a test. This worked well, and soon the engine was working hard to finish the line. But the engine was barely capable of hauling a few wagons, and definitely would not be able to keep up with the strain of regular passenger traffic. So Moore began to work on another motor, with this one intended to run passenger services until the Stephenson's locomotives arrived. There is a lot of debate around this locomotive, and some of what I say may be incorrect, but this is the most likely series of events. Sometime in late June, it became clear to Moore that the ballasting engine just wouldn't be up to passenger services if such a need arose. As such, he began designing a larger engine for use on the line. The engine would be based on a wagon, however this time it would have a dedicated boiler and pair of driving wheels. This boiler was manufactured locally at Langland's Port Phillip foundry with 58 internal pipes and no manhole for access once it had been sealed. A simple smoke box and funnel were mounted on the front, and a rather rudimentary firebox and throttle were mounted for the crew. The outside of the boiler was clad in timber insulation to protect the crew and preserve the engine. Underneath the boiler was the water tank, which was all mounted on a modified wooden frame. The two wheels of the wagon were bunched up near the rear, and a larger pair of driving wheels were affixed to the front. These wheels were connected to what was likely a paddle steamer axle, and then connected to a pair of 8-inch cylinders. In total, the engine took 10 weeks to construct and was first tested on the 12th of September. It would then haul the first passenger train merely a day later on the 13th. But before we get into that, you may have some questions. You see, almost all of the artwork you see of this engine depicts it as a 222 engine. So you may be asking, what makes me describe it as an 024? Well, let me show you. This image from the book Victorian Railways to 1962. This is the first depiction of the engine as a 222, and look at it. Do you really think an engine constructed in 10 weeks would have the time and material to fit a full brass steam dome and valves? In order to find its true nature, we have to use contemporary sources. There are two pieces of artwork from the time drawn by artist Samuel T. Gill that can be used to detail the train. The first and most famous is certainly lacking a few features, most notably the wheels of the engine. It's just levitating. For being the centerpiece of the work, it's certainly an odd omission, but luckily Gill also made another image of the terminus, and this one is much better. I can find no online copies of this work, and the only version I can find is in my rather aged copy of Victorian Railways to 1962, the same book that began the myth of the 222 engine. This clearly depicts an 024 engine, and combined with the testimony from workers and contractors that worked with the engine later in its life, we get a much better understanding of the engine than this generic half-assed diagram made 108 years later. The first passenger service on the line was assembled at Sandridge in the late morning hours of the 13th of September 1854. It was led by Moore's improvised engine, which was then followed by 2 second-class carriages, a single first-class carriage, and then an open wagon. This train was then hauled empty from Sandridge to Flinders, where it arrived sometime around 11 o'clock. The engine was run around, and preparation for departure commenced. The open wagon was filled with the band of Her Majesty's 40th Regiment, and several guests, most notably Lieutenant Governor Charles Hotham, boarded the train. It set off at roughly 12:20, and just 10 minutes later it would arrive. A grand banquet was held at the company yard, and 2 additional trips were taken to ferry all of the guests. Almost all of the ships in the bay were dressed in flags, and the ships HMS Electra and HMS Fantôme performed gun salutes to commemorate the occasion. The next day, on the 14th, regularly scheduled passenger services began. Services ran from Sandridge half-hourly from 8:30 to noon, when an hour-and-a-half-long break was taken to restock the engine. Services resumed at 1:30, with the last trip departing at 6:30 p.m. On Sundays, the morning period only lasted from 8:30 to 10 o'clock. Fares charged were 1 shilling for second class and 1 shilling 6 for first class. Children from the age of 3 to 10, as well as soldiers, were entitled to half fares, and children under the age of 3 were able to travel for free. Everything worked well for the first several days, however the limitations of the engine soon became apparent. Only 6 days into scheduled service, the engine broke down due to a defective crank axle. Makeshift repairs took place, and it returned to service the next day. This held for a little bit longer, however on the 9th the axle was fractured severely and would need to be replaced. This took 2 days, returning to service on the 11th. All was well until December 1st, when the replacement axle shattered entirely and services were suspended until the English locomotives arrived. One thing quickly noticed along the line was the rapidly eroding base upon which the tracks and ballast lay. This was quickly blamed on lead engineer Moore, despite him playing really no part in the situation. He was dismissed on December 12th. It just so happens that another event occurred in early December for the company. Sometime between the 4th and the 6th, the ship Jane Francis docked at Sandridge Pier, unloading 2 locomotives, several tons of coke, kilometres of iron track, and 1 freshly immigrated railway engineer, William Eldson. Eldson had chosen to follow the engines to Melbourne on behalf of Stephenson and Company, and it was his presence in the city that likely gave the company its main motivation to fire Moore. Alongside Moore's departure, a new company president was elected on the 6th. Henty was voted out in favour of William Nicholson, who was one of the oldest supporters of the line and its biggest financial investor. The first set of Stephenson's engines were rather typical English engines of that era. They were 240 tank engines with external cylinders of a 12-inch diameter and a 20-inch stroke. Crew accommodation was lacking, with only a simple weatherboard to protect the crew from the elements. The first engine, Stephenson's number 954 of 1854, named Melbourne, was ready for service on Christmas Day. The next engine, number 955, Sandridge, was ready on the 5th of January of the following year, and the pair of engines would therefore take turns running service each day. In the 4 months of operation in 1854, £3,782 of profit were recorded by the line. This initial success was reassuring to the company, as they were now confident in the financial viability of their line. Around this time, an extra goods warehouse was constructed at Sandridge in preparation for the increased traffic in the following years. 1855 would prove to be a big year for the company. In January, on the 26th, the Hannaconna docked at Sandridge Pier, and over the next several days the last 2 locomotives were unloaded. These were number 956 Victoria and number 957 Yarra. Victoria would enter service in mid-March, and Yarra would be running by early April. These engines provided the company with operational spares and also allowed goods to be conveyed on the line freely without interrupting passenger traffic. Early 1855 also saw the company's first venture outside of trains. Sometime in January, the company decided to purchase the steamship Comet to run a ferry service from Gem Pier in Williamstown to the pier at Sandridge. The institution of this ferry greatly simplified the journey of passengers originating in Williamstown, saving them a long walk via Footscray. It serves as a good display of what separated the MNH-BRC from other early railway companies, as they were willing to venture beyond railways to bolster profits with little expense. As 1855 progressed, the track quality along the line grew worse and worse. Eldson soon embarked to reballast the whole line, and whilst that certainly improved conditions, it did not remedy the issue. It became clear that the line would have to eventually be upgraded from the 55-pound rails currently in use. However, the company simply lacked the finances at that time. 1855 also saw the expansion of ferry services from Sandridge, with various private enterprises operating monthly ferries to Hobart, Adelaide and Portland. A separate service to Geelong was operated twice daily, utilising the steamers Duncan Hoyle and Citizen. This increase in traffic led to a need to extend the pier, and by the end of the year it had reached 500 feet in length. These improvements resulted in over 150 vessels using the pier in 1855, with the line carrying 28,135 tonnes of cargo and 270,408 passengers. This success resulted in a profit of £25,864 on the line, over a quarter of the initial investment on the line returned in just a single year. But 1855 was not all good for the company. On April 20th, the station master at Sandridge, Eberl Canty, attempted to jump from a moving train as it pulled into a station. However, unfortunately, his foot became wedged in the footboard and he fell rather roughly onto the adjacent siding. One of his legs was entirely shattered below the knee, and despite receiving an urgent amputation, he would succumb to his injuries 3 days later. He became the first railway worker to lose their life in the performance of their duty in Victoria. In the meantime, work towards the St Kilda branch had continued. A new line was surveyed, running along Ferris Street in Emerald Hill through the Albert Park Swamp to St Kilda. This alignment was shorter, however the path through the centre of the township meant that the aforementioned need for crossings on the line to be grade separated proved challenging. Eldson reckoned he could construct the line as a light £55 per yard railway for just £38,000, and even cheaper if he was able to defer a bridge over City Road. The line would continue to be planned through 1856, and later that year it would receive parliamentary approval. 1856 proved yet another successful year for the company. 394,361 passengers utilised the line within the year, alongside 68,851 tonnes of cargo. This represented a growth of over 100% from the year before, and this was shown clearly through the company's profit of almost £30,000. By the end of the year, work was well underway on the branch of St Kilda, however the expected cost had risen to £50,000. Going into 1857, the Melbourne and Hobson's Bay Railway Company was in a better position than ever. It was seeing record passenger numbers, and its peer was seeing the majority of international trade with Melbourne. It was clear that this company had a bright future ahead of it. But that will have to wait. This video is the first part in a larger series on Melbourne's private railways and how they shaped the network we ride today. The next video in this series will be focused on the much more ambitious Geelong and Melbourne Railway Company, followed by another finishing the story of this railway. Thank you for watching. Sorry it's been a while between videos. I started a few and then I got bored, or I just realised they weren't really interesting topics, so I put them aside and finally settled on this. Yeah, and I've definitely increased the production quality for this one, so I had to relearn Blender and whatnot. It took a fair while. But future videos should be, better than this one visually. Given my skills improve even more. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.